I was working the front desk at a hostel in Amsterdam when an American guy walked up with his suitcase and asked me where he could plug in his hairdryer. I pointed to the wall outlet. He stared at it like I'd just shown him ancient hieroglyphics. "No, I mean a real outlet," he said. "Like a normal one." I explained that was a normal outlet. For Europe. He pulled out his American plug and held it up to the European socket, like somehow willpower would make it fit. "But I brought my own hairdryer," he said, genuinely confused why the entire continent hadn't planned around his appliances. I handed him an adapter. He looked at the adapter like it was a personal betrayal. "Why doesn't Europe just use regular plugs?" he asked. I didn't have the heart to tell him that 230 volts was about to teach him a very loud lesson about what regular actually means. This is exactly the kind of moment I track, not just what Americans do abroad, but what it reveals about how we think. If you see the pattern too, you're the kind of viewer who should probably be subscribed. My co-worker in Berlin told me about an American couple who came into her cafe every morning for a week. Sweet people, very friendly, but every single day, they'd finish their coffee and just sit there, waiting. Finally, on day 7, the woman flagged her down and said, "Excuse me, but is our waitress coming back? We've been waiting for our check for like 20 minutes." My coworker explained they don't bring you the check in Germany. You go up and pay when you're ready. The woman looked genuinely shocked. "But how do they know we're done?" she asked. My coworker pointed at their empty cups. "Because your cups are empty." The husband shook his head and said, "In America, they'd have flipped this table 3 times by now." He said it like it was a good thing. I had a roommate from Boston who moved to Copenhagen for work. First week he came home furious. "The grocery store workers are so rude here," he said. I asked what happened. I smiled at the cashier and said, "Good morning," and she just scanned my stuff without saying anything back. I explained that Danes are more reserved. That silence doesn't mean rudeness. He wasn't convinced. She didn't even ask how my day was going. I told him she probably assumed he knew how his own day was going. He spent the next month trying to crack the cashiers with enthusiasm. They did not crack. Eventually, he learned that in Denmark, efficiency is kindness. But for those first few weeks, he genuinely believed the entire country was mad at him personally. Most people stop at the funny surface of stories like this. I'm more interested in what they expose, the invisible rules we all think are universal. If that kind of analysis speaks to you, you know where you belong. Another guy I met in Prague told me he'd been walking around for 3 days trying to find where they kept the real food. I asked what he meant. You know, normal food. Burgers, fries, stuff you can recognize. I told him he was in Prague. They have their own food. He looked at me like I'd suggested he eat rocks. "But what if I don't like it?" he asked. I suggested he try it first. He eventually found a restaurant that served schnitzel and spent the whole meal explaining to me how it was basically just a chicken tender. The optimism was impressive. The cultural awareness was not. I was giving a walking tour in Paris when an American woman asked how far the Eiffel Tower was. I said about 3 kilometers. She stared at me. "In real distance, though?" I told her that was real distance. She pulled out her phone and started Googling conversion rates like she was trading currency. "So that's like 100 miles?" she asked. I told her it was less than 2 miles. She looked relieved, but also mildly offended that I hadn't just said that from the start. The whole group waited while she did math in her notes app. Eventually, she just said, "Okay, we'll walk and see what happens." My friend worked at a train station in Brussels. An American guy came up and asked what time the train to Amsterdam left. She said 1600 hours. He blinked. "Is that like 4 in the afternoon?" She confirmed. He nodded slowly. "Why not just say 4 p.m.? She explained that 24-hour time removes confusion. He thought about this. "But it adds confusion for Americans," he countered, as if that settled it. She printed his ticket. He looked at it and said, "Wait, this says 1600. I need the 4 p.m. train. She closed her eyes and took a very long breath. A couple came into a clothing store in Stockholm, where my cousin worked. The wife tried on a jacket and loved it. Her husband checked the tag. It says it's 99 euros, but that can't be right, he said. That's like $1,000. My cousin explained the conversion rate. He pulled out his phone and Googled it anyway. Oh, he said, visibly relieved. So it's only like $110. Why didn't the tag just say that? His wife bought the jacket. He spent the rest of the transaction explaining to my cousin how much easier shopping would be if Europe just switched to dollars. My cousin smiled and said nothing. She is very patient. I met an American student in Munich who complained that her apartment was like 100 degrees. I asked if she'd tried opening a window. She said she had, but it was still unbearable. I asked what temperature it actually was. She checked her thermostat. 23, she said. I explained that was Celsius, that it was actually only 73 Fahrenheit. She looked at the thermostat like it had lied to her. Why would they use a different temperature system? She asked. I didn't have a good answer. Or rather, I had a very long historical answer that I knew she didn't want. She spent the next week asking me to translate temperatures before she adjusted anything. Eventually, she just started leaving all the windows open and hoping for the best. Another tour guide I know told me about an American man who asked why European streets were so confusing. They just go everywhere, he said. There's no grid. She explained that most European cities were built centuries before cars existed, that they grew organically around medieval trade routes and old walls. He processed this. Right, but couldn't they just fix it? He asked. Like knock it down and start over with a grid? She told him these were historic buildings, protected sites. He nodded like he understood, but then said, yeah, but it would make driving so much easier. The optimism that you could just redesign Rome was genuinely inspiring. I was helping an American family in Vienna find their way to a museum. The dad kept looking at Google Maps and frowning. This doesn't make sense, he said. It says we turn right, but the street sign says something else. I looked at the map. Google said turn right. The street sign said rechts, which is German for right. I explained this. He zoomed in on his phone. But it says R-E-C-H-T-S. That's not right. I told him that was because he was in Austria, and they speak German here. He looked up from his phone at the actual country around him like he'd forgotten where he was. Oh, he said. Then, after a pause, does Google Maps come in English? My roommate in Lisbon told me about an American tourist who got mad at a restaurant for listing prices in euros. I can't do math that fast, the guy said. The waiter offered to help convert. The American shook his head. No, you don't get it. You should have prices in dollars, too. For tourists. The waiter pointed out that this was Portugal, that euros were their actual currency. The guy said, right, but most of your tourists are American. The waiter said most of their tourists were actually European. The guy didn't believe him. He paid in cash and counted it out very slowly, double-checking each bill, like the numbers might change. While he wasn't looking, another friend in Scotland told me about an American woman who asked why the weather forecast was wrong. My friend asked what she meant. The woman showed her phone. It says it's 12 degrees, but it's definitely not 12 degrees. It's like 50-something. My friend explained it was Celsius. The woman put her phone away. You know what? I'm just not going to trust the weather here. And she didn't. For her entire trip, she packed for snow every single day, just in case. It was July. I worked at a hotel in Switzerland, where an American guest called the front desk at 11 p.m. to complain about the silence. I asked if something was wrong with his room. He said, no, it's just really quiet. Like scary quiet. I explained that this was normal, that Swiss buildings have good sound insulation and people are generally quiet at night. He said, but what if there's an emergency? How would anyone know? I assured him that in an emergency, people would make noise. He wasn't convinced. He asked if we had a TV channel that just played background noise. We did not. He ended up leaving his bathroom fan on all night just so he could sleep. My friend worked at a bar in Dublin. An American guy came in and ordered a Guinness. When she handed him the pint, he pulled out a €5 note and put it on the bar. She poured the next customer's drink. The American waved the money at her. "Miss, I'm ready to pay." She told him she'd settle up when he was done. He looked confused. "But I want to pay now." She explained that in Ireland, you usually pay at the end. He reluctantly put the money back in his wallet, but kept it out on the bar, just in case. Every 10 minutes, he'd try to pay again. She'd wave him off. Finally, when he finished and actually wanted to pay, he'd put the money away and had to dig through his pockets to find it again. The cycle was exhausting for everyone. A different American in the same bar asked why everyone was so quiet. My friend pointed out that people were having conversations. "Yeah, but like quiet conversations," he said. "Why isn't anyone louder? How do you have fun?" She told him this was fun. He looked around at people enjoying their drinks and talking at reasonable volumes. "In America, you can't even hear yourself think in a bar." She said, "Maybe that's the idea." He didn't get it. He spent his whole night talking twice as loud as everyone else, trying to inject energy into a room that was perfectly happy with its energy level. I had a roommate from Texas who moved to Germany for grad school. She could not understand why shops closed on Sundays. "But what if you need something?" she'd ask every single weekend. I'd explain that Germans plan ahead, that they shop on Saturday, that sometimes having a day where everything closes is actually nice. She'd shake her head. "But what about freedom?" she'd say, genuinely, as if the freedom to buy socks at midnight was enshrined in human rights law. Eventually, she started hoarding groceries on Saturdays, like she was prepping for an apocalypse. Her side of the fridge looked like a bunker. My cousin worked at a tour company in Italy. An American woman asked if they had tours that were less walky. My cousin asked what she meant. The woman said, "You know, where you don't walk as much. Like you just stand in one place and they bring the sights to you." My cousin explained that the sights were buildings and they generally don't move. The woman nodded but seemed disappointed. She booked the walking tour and complained about the walking the entire time. At one point, she stopped in front of the Colosseum and said, "This would be so much better with a drive-through option." Another tour guide told me about an American couple who got frustrated that Italians were speaking Italian. "We're clearly tourists," the husband said. "Why don't they just switch to English when they see us?" The guide explained that not everyone speaks English, that this was Italy. The wife nodded. "Right, but everyone learns English in school, don't they?" The guide said some do, but not fluently. The husband shook his head. "That's so inconvenient," he said, as if the country's language choices were a customer service issue. I was at a dinner party in France, where an American guy asked why everyone was taking so long to eat. "We've been here for like 2 hours," he said. I explained that French meals are meant to be slow, social. The guy looked at his watch. "But don't you have stuff to do?" I told him this was the stuff we were doing. He couldn't wrap his head around it. He kept checking his phone like there was somewhere else he was supposed to be. Finally, he just said, "In America, we'd have been in and out in 30 minutes. One of the French guests smiled and said, "We know." The American took it as a compliment. My friend in Amsterdam told me about an American tourist who got upset that the bikes didn't stop for him in the bike lane. "I was just walking," he said, "and they almost hit me." She explained that he was walking in the bike lane. "That bikes have the right of way there." He said, "But I'm a pedestrian." She pointed to the sidewalk. "That's where pedestrians go." He looked offended. "In America, pedestrians always have the right of way," she said. "In Amsterdam, that attitude will get you hit by a bike." He didn't believe her until he saw 3 more tourists nearly get taken out in the same spot. Then he believed her. A guy I met in London complained that everyone was too polite. I asked what he meant. He said, "Like they say sorry for everything, even when it's not their fault." I explained that this was just British culture. He shook his head. But doesn't that get confusing? How do you know when someone actually means it? I told him you just know. He wasn't satisfied. For the rest of his trip, every time someone said sorry, he'd respond with, "It's okay. You didn't do anything wrong," very earnestly. The Brits did not know what to do with this. They'd just say sorry again. It became a loop. I was working airport security in Frankfurt when an American passenger asked where the train to Paris was. I told him this was an airport. He'd need to go to the train station. He looked confused. But don't airports have trains? I explained that airports have trains that go to other parts of the airport, not to other countries. He pulled out his phone and showed me a booking. He'd bought a plane ticket and a train ticket, but seemed to think they were connected. "So how do I get to the train?" he asked. I gave him directions to the Hauptbahnhof. He wrote down Hauptbahnhof in his notes app. I corrected the spelling. He said, "It's fine. The taxi driver will know what I mean." The taxi driver probably did not know what he meant. My friend worked at a rental car agency in Rome. An American guy returned a car with the entire front bumper scratched. She asked what happened. He said the streets were too narrow. She pointed out that other people managed to drive the same streets. He said, "Yeah, but they're used to it." She asked if he'd hit anything. He thought about it. Just some walls, and maybe a scooter, but it was parked. She processed the paperwork. He asked if the damage fee could be waived, since the streets shouldn't be that narrow anyway. It could not. A couple from California asked me how to get to Europe from London. I asked which part of Europe. They said, "Just Europe, the main part." I explained that Europe is a continent with many countries. They needed to be more specific. The wife said, "Wherever the Eiffel Tower is." I said, "That's Paris." They nodded. "Right, Europe." I booked them a Eurostar ticket. The husband asked if they needed passports to go to Europe. I said yes. He seemed surprised. "But we're already in Europe." I explained that the UK is in Europe geographically, but they'd need passports for France. He said, "This is way more complicated than Disney World." I met an American woman in Budapest who'd accidentally booked a hostel in Bucharest. She didn't realize until she landed. "Aren't they the same place?" she asked. I told her they were different countries. She checked her booking. "But they both start with BU." I explained that didn't make them the same city. She had to book a whole new flight. When she finally arrived in Budapest, she told everyone she met about how Europe has too many cities with similar names. Someone pointed out that America has a Paris in Texas. She said that was different. No one was sure how. My cousin worked at a train station in Belgium. An American guy asked why his ticket said Bruxelles instead of Brussels. She explained those are the same city. French spelling versus English. He looked at his ticket suspiciously. "So this will take me to Brussels?" She confirmed. He still seemed uncertain. "But what if the train goes to the French one?" She told him there's only one Brussels. He nodded but didn't look convinced. He kept asking other passengers if they were going to the English Brussels or the French one. They were very patient with him. Another traveler I heard about tried to tip a train conductor in Sweden. The conductor politely declined. The American insisted. "It's for good service." The conductor explained they don't accept tips, that they're paid a salary. The American pushed the money forward. "Everyone accepts tips." The conductor pushed it back. This went on for 3 stops. Finally, the American just left the money on his seat when he got off, like he'd won a silent standoff. The conductor turned it in to Lost and Found. I was helping an American tourist in Amsterdam who couldn't figure out why his credit card kept getting declined. I asked if he'd told his bank he was traveling. He said, "Why would I do that?" I explained that banks often freeze cards when they see foreign transactions. He called his bank. They unfroze it. He hung up and said, "That's so dumb. How are you supposed to travel if your card doesn't work?" I suggested calling the bank before traveling. He said that seemed like a lot of steps. I told him it was one phone call. He said, "Exactly." My friend in Prague told me about an American who asked why the signs weren't in English. "How is anyone supposed to read them?" he asked. My friend explained that the signs were in Czech because this was the Czech Republic. The guy said, "Right, but for tourists." She told him that most tourists in Prague were from other European countries and could figure it out. He didn't believe her. But America has the most tourists. She told him that wasn't actually true. He Googled it. He was wrong. He still seemed skeptical of his own Google results. A woman in Vienna asked me why everyone was dressed so fancy for the train. I looked around. People were wearing normal clothes, jeans, sweaters. I asked what she meant. She said, "Everyone looks so put together. Don't they have sweatpants?" I explained that Europeans generally don't wear pajamas in public. She looked down at her outfit, leggings and a college hoodie. "This isn't pajamas," she said defensively. I told her it was fine. She spent the rest of the train ride convinced everyone was judging her. They probably weren't. But she adjusted her hoodie every 5 minutes, just in case. Another guy told me he was disappointed that Paris looked so old. I asked what he expected. He said, "I don't know. More modern? Like newer buildings?" I explained that the old buildings were the reason people visited. He said, "Yeah, but wouldn't it be better if they fixed them up?" I told him the buildings were fixed up. He meant rebuilt, like make them look cleaner and newer. I didn't have the heart to explain that he wanted Paris to look less like Paris. I was back at the hostel in Amsterdam a few months later when the same American guy from the beginning walked in. Different trip, same confusion. He recognized me. "Hey, plug girl," he said. I waved. He held up an adapter. I came prepared this time. I was genuinely proud. Then he pulled out his hairdryer and plugged it in. There was a loud pop. The lights in his room went out. He'd brought a dual-voltage adapter, but not a dual-voltage hairdryer. "Why did it explode?" he asked. I explained voltage. Again. He nodded slowly. "So I need a different hairdryer?" I confirmed. He sat down on the lobby couch and laughed. "You know what? I'm just going to let my hair air dry for 2 weeks. He did. And honestly, it looked fine. The thing about Americans abroad isn't that they're bad travelers. They're not. They're enthusiastic. They're curious. They ask questions. They show up ready to have experiences. It's just that sometimes the experience is learning that the rest of the world doesn't work like a slightly inconvenient version of America. It works like itself. And that takes adjusting too. I've seen Americans figure it out. The guy who couldn't understand Celsius eventually started checking the weather in both units. The woman who hated how slow French dinners were ended up staying in Paris an extra week because she loved the pace. The couple who got lost between Brussels and Bucharest now plan their trips with multiple maps and double-check their spelling. They learn, they adapt, they come back. But those first few days? Those first moments of genuine confusion when the outlets don't fit, and the measurements don't make sense, and nobody's loud, and the streets weren't designed for cars? Those moments are universal. Every American abroad has a version of the plug story, the temperature story, the tipping story, and they're all funny because they're all true. My favorite part is watching the moment it clicks. When they stop trying to convert everything back to familiar units and just accept that 3 kilometers is 3 kilometers. When they realize that paying at the end of the meal means they can sit as long as they want. When they understand that quiet doesn't mean unfriendly. When they stop asking why Europe doesn't work like America and start asking how Europe works, period. Because once that shift happens, they're not tourists anymore. They're travelers, and that's when the real stories start. That's the shift I chase in every episode. The moment confusion turns into understanding. If you want that lens on every culture clash, subscribe now and stay 3 moves ahead of the next one. I've got about 100 more of these. Stories about Americans trying to understand roundabouts. Stories about portion sizes. Stories about the fact that yes, you really do have to pay to use some public bathrooms. Stories about pharmacies that close for lunch. Stories about cappuccinos that you can't get after 11 a.m. without judgment. And trust me, these stories never stop coming. Because every day, someone new gets off a plane with an American plug and a European outlet, and the whole beautiful, confusing cycle starts again.